She was left standing alone on the snowy platform. The man who promised her a new life turned away the moment he saw her body. It felt like the whole world went quiet, watching her humiliation. Then, a stranger stepped out of the crowd and said something simple, but unthinkable. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen it all. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind pushed against the station windows with a low, mournful groan, as if echoing the ache blooming quietly in Lillian's chest. Inside, the waiting room was half lit by a single kerosene lamp, its flame flickering weakly in the drafty stillness. She sat on the wooden bench near the stove, but the heat barely reached her. The suitcase rested at her feet, its brass clasp worn smooth by time and hope. She had chosen her dress carefully, a dusky rose calico with a faded lace collar, ironed until every pleat held shape, every thread a silent testimony to effort. She had imagined him noticing it, maybe saying something gentle. She hadn't dared hope for love, not quite. But kindness? A beginning? Yes. Instead, her ears still rang with the sharp weight of that word. Large. As though it were a disqualification. As though her softness, once praised by her late father as the kind of strength you can lean into, were something shameful now. She stared straight ahead, unblinking, as the door creaked with the comings and goings of strangers wrapped in heavy coats and hurried conversation. No one looked at her twice. She was a shape on a bench, a story they didn't ask about. The brooch on her coat, a tarnished brass daisy, had belonged to her mother, who used to say, "Sometimes we bloom in places no one sees, but we still bloom." Lillian reached up and touched it gently, her thumb circling its edges. The gesture steadied her. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not the playful kind, but slow, heavy flakes that swallowed sound and made the world feel farther away. She imagined the house George must have returned to. The silence there. The fire crackling. A thinner woman in her place, perhaps. Or no one at all. She closed her eyes, and for a moment the pain threatened to spill. But it didn't. Not yet. Instead, she adjusted her skirt, folded her hands in her lap, and sat taller. Not to be seen, not to be chosen, but because her dignity, once bruised, was still intact. And though the dream had just died at her feet, something within her, some ancient ember passed down through the women of her line, refused to let her crumble in front of strangers. Not tonight, not here, not. The station had mostly emptied by then, the wind sweeping snow against the wooden siding like sandpaper against old wood. The stove in the corner hissed and ticked, warming no one but itself. Lillian sat as she had for the last hour, unmoving, composed, but hollowed out from the inside, as though rejection had scooped something vital from her and left the rest to sit in its place. Her fingers curled around the fraying edge of her coat sleeve, tugging gently, as if by fidgeting she could smooth away the ache that pooled in her belly. Around her, silence pressed in. Not oppressive, just vast. Like the prairie stretching past the tracks, white and unbroken. And then came the sound of slow, measured footsteps on the wood. Not hesitant, not hurried. Steady, intentional. Lillian didn't look up at first. The voice that followed was quiet but grounded. "You waiting on someone?" It wasn't the question that startled her. It was the tone. Not pitying, not curious, just human. She lifted her gaze. He was taller than she'd guessed, close now. Snow clung to his shoulders in small crystalline patches. A man shaped more by weather than mirrors, broad-handed, his coat mended in 2 places, beard dusted with frost. But his eyes... His eyes held warmth that felt like standing near a hearth after days in the cold. "No," she said, her voice brittle at the edges. "He already left." His silence wasn't awkward. It was patient, as if he understood that some answers came heavy and didn't need explaining. Then came the name, Samuel Dawson. And a story, brief but worn. A buried wife, a long winter. Loss layered over loss. But when he spoke again, his words reached past politeness. "If a man can walk away from someone like you," he began, and she flinched, already bracing for another polite cruelty, "then he doesn't deserve a fire in his hearth." That pause inside her, it wasn't disbelief, it was recognition of something long forgotten. She looked at him directly now, studied him, noted the crack at the corner of his thumbnail, the way he didn't shift his weight like most men when speaking to her. He stood steady, like he wasn't looking for beauty, but for truth. "Miss Harper." His voice caught slightly, like the words had weight. "If you'll have me, I'd be honored to take you home, as my wife." The floor didn't tilt, the room didn't spin, but something inside her, the part she thought had frozen months ago, moved. Tears came quietly, slipping down her cheeks without sobs, without protest. They weren't shameful, they were cleansing. Because for the first time in a long time, the world had tilted toward her, and not away. The farmhouse stood at the edge of the prairie like something forgotten and faithful, its porch sagging gently under the weight of memory, its shutters faded by years of sun and wind. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and dust and something older still, perhaps longing, perhaps time itself. Lillian stepped over the threshold without ceremony, her carpet bag in one hand, her breath steady. She'd brought no dowry but herself, and that, she had decided, was no small gift. The floors creaked, not in protest, but in greeting. The walls bore the quiet patience of solitude. Samuel had cleared space, not just a drawer, but the windowsill in the kitchen, the empty rocker by the stove, the silence beside him at breakfast. He hadn't said, "Make yourself at home." He had made space so she could. She rose early each morning, not out of obligation, but rhythm. She stitched long into the afternoon, her hands remembering every movement of the needle like prayer. The first quilt she made was pieced from scraps of old shirts and sackcloth, sewn not for beauty, but warmth. When she spread it across their bed, Samuel ran his hand over the stitches like a man rediscovering texture, saying nothing, but lingering long after the touch should have passed. In the kitchen, she baked with a kind of reverence, measuring by feel, by scent, by memory. Her pies did not boast elaborate lattices or perfect crusts. But when the pastor bit into a slice of her apple pie at Sunday supper, he set down his fork mid-bite, eyes damp, whispering, "Tastes like my mother's prayers." Lillian only nodded and wiped her hands on her apron. Out back, where weeds once gripped the soil like a fist, she planted tulips, bulbs passed down from a woman at church who said they'd take root if you treat them kind. And so she did. Each morning, Lillian knelt in the dirt like it was sacred, speaking softly to leaves and roots, her hands tender with something too old for words and too strong for doubt. The town watched, of course, at first with curiosity, then with suspicion, and eventually with quiet awe. They'd expected her to fade into Samuel's shadow. Instead, she became something else entirely, an answer to questions they didn't know they were asking. She didn't change the world. She softened it, with fabric, with flour, with flowers. And Samuel, a man of few declarations, once paused mid-evening as she read aloud in the fire's glow and said, "You make this house a hymn." And she, without looking up, whispered, "Amen." The light that morning was soft, filtered through early spring clouds that painted the sky in brushed linen tones. The church bell had just rung the quarter hour, and Lillian Harper stood in the shade of the old elm, her arms full of white lilacs. She moved with ease, not with the caution of someone trying to stay unseen, but with the quiet grace of a woman who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. The yellow shawl she wore over her shoulders shimmered faintly in the morning light, a shawl spun with her own hands, each stitch a thread of becoming. She didn't notice him at first. George Whitmore's boots hit the dust like they still owned it. He walked slower than he used to, not because of humility, but habit, the gait of a man who assumed people would make way. At his side clung a girl, narrow as a reed, eyes downcast, steps uncertain. She held his arm like someone trained to hold on, not to belong. When George stopped at the foot of the church steps, his gaze landed on Lillian, and stuck. It took him a moment to reconcile what he was seeing. The full curve of her, the serene lift of her chin, the self-assurance woven into how she placed the lilacs, one stem at a time, like the arrangement mattered not because others would see it, but because she would. "You look different," he said finally, his voice halting, not from emotion but from confusion. Lillian turned, her smile soft and unflinching. "I am." There was no cruelty in her tone, no vindication, just a calm that made George's throat tighten. She wasn't trying to win anything. She'd already won. Then Samuel stepped beside her, a quiet strength in motion. His hand settled naturally on the small of her back, not as possession, but as belonging. "She's mine," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words, simple as wood and stone, rippled through the air like a hymn sung low and clear. For the first time in memory, George Whitmore found himself on the wrong side of stillness. The townspeople, who once spoke of her in whispers, now only watched. And in that silence, something shifted. Not just in George's eyes, but in the shape of the world. That evening, as dusk crept in like lavender across the fields, Lillian ran her fingers along the finished quilt. Each patch told a story, not of hardship, but of having come through it. She laid it across their bed without ceremony, turned back the covers, and slid beside the man who had never once asked her to be less. "Funny," she murmured, resting her head near his shoulder. "I thought I'd come to find love." Samuel, already half drifting into sleep, whispered, "Turns out, it came looking for you." Outside, the tulips bent slightly in the breeze, heavy with bloom, unapologetic, open, and entirely enough.